Okay, part B of lecture 16. Let's continue with our discussion of colonial paper money. So, for part A of this lecture, we discussed bills of credit and explained why it was that these bills had value, legal tender laws, but also taxes. Any sort of tax payment. You could use this bill of credit, you could use this bill in lieu of coin to settle your tax payments, and taxes always going to be around. You're always going to have to pay taxes, and so this bill had value and thus circulated throughout the economy. And this was the original paper money bill, but eventually, as the 18th century continued, progressed, the bills became more sophisticated, such as this bill from New Jersey in 1764. But bills of credit were not the only way for a colonial government to issue paper currency. There was another way to emit paper currency, and that was through land banks, colonial land banks. Now, coin was relatively scarce in the colonies, mostly because of trade deficits. However, what wasn't scarce was land. There was lots of land, and even if you were a lower middle class colonist, you had the ability to own several acres or more of land. And so the idea came into people's minds, hey, maybe we could back our paper currency, a second form of paper currency, by land instead of coin. And actually, this idea of a land bank, a paper currency backed by land instead of silver and gold, actually originated in England in the 1650s, but it was never adopted in England. England decided upon the more conventional mode of backing paper banknotes by coin instead of land, but it latches on here in colonial America. So just a brief description of what this land bank was exactly. First of all, the fact that it's called bank can, perhaps trip us up a little bit, because it wasn't a bank in the conventional sense of, accepting deposits, and there are no deposits in a land bank. Only lending. Moreover, these were not run privately, but were run directly by the government. So the colonial legislature would decide, okay, let's establish this land bank, and this land bank will lend out 30,000 pounds of paper currency. So the bank is government run, only involved in lending, and then it lent paper notes to anyone that had property, usually land to mortgage. So the land that was possessed by the borrower who wants to borrow paper notes, the land was used as collateral for that new debt. So in this case, actually, the debtor isn't the government. The debtor is the borrower of these paper notes, the one who mortgaged his land. And then over a period of years, the borrower would make yearly installments, payments on the principal plus interest with those paper notes. And you may ask, well, then why did he borrow paper notes to begin with if he's just going to pay them back all over again? Well, you might need paper notes to embark on some new project, to improve your land, all sorts of different reasons why you would want to borrow paper notes and have access to that money in the short term, to that currency in the short term, and then over a period of 5, 6, 7, 8 years, pay that back plus a little bit of interest. Now, if you were a borrower and you defaulted on your debt, you were unable to pay your debt, then the land bank, since it has your mortgage, since you've mortgaged your property, the land bank can then sell your property the land bank would sell your property for the requisite amount of notes, for those paper notes, and thus would those paper notes would return back to the land bank. So in a sense, the argument was that these notes were, quote, backed by land instead of coin. In fact, Benjamin Franklin, who was a big proponent of land banks, called this form of currency, quote, coined land. Now this too can be a bit deceptive, because when we say that banknotes are backed by coin, by silver and gold coin, what we mean is you could go to the bank counter and anybody could redeem their notes for silver or gold coin. So, but you couldn't do that here. You couldn't just, if you came across paper notes, you couldn't just go to the land bank and say, oh, I stumbled across this paper note, I'd like to redeem it, please, for land. It didn't work. That's not how it works. So it wasn't backed in that sense. It's still an irredeemable note. It's still an inconvertible note. However, it's backed in the sense that you have real property, land, that has given it some value. And that even in the event of the borrower defaulting, the land bank can still draw in that paper money by selling the property. The notes would enter circulation because, again, they were legal tender. You could use the notes anytime for tax payments, and so they're legal tender or for private payments. And, even if you didn't borrow any money from the land bank, you would still accept this currency in everyday payment because you knew other people wanted this currency to make payments on the principal, again, to make tax payments, whatever. And so these notes experience a wide circulation, and then oftentimes the interest that the land bank earned from these payments, the government would then use that interest to finance various public expenditures. It's a bit of a complex system, but innovative and worked quite effectively in some colonies, and other colonies not so much. So here's an example. Let's say you're a farmer and you have so much amount of land. The land, and you go to approach the land bank. I'd like to borrow money. The land bank would have an assessor, come to your property and assess the value of your property. The assessor come back and say, this property worth in the market about 200 pounds. Land bank would say, okay, a conservative land bank would say, okay, 200 pound property, we'll play it safe and lend you 100 pounds of paper notes. Okay, you mortgage your land. The land is a pledge from you, the borrower, that you're going to repay at a future date that 100 pounds. And over a period, in this example, of 7 years, you pay the principal plus interest. And if the farmer, God forbid, defaults, the land bank sells the mortgage property for the paper notes. Either way, the paper notes come back in. The paper notes are retired. And all is well, in theory. In practice, didn't always work out so well. We'll see an example of that in a second here. But so these are the two types of colonial paper money. Bills of credit, already talked about that. Land bank currency. Both of these currencies were, and they're interchangeable. They don't necessarily look any different. Each colony had their own unique currency, but within the colony itself, it's not like a land bank note looked different than a bill of credit. Oftentimes they were the same note, but they were issued differently. This one issued by the Treasury through the spending of new money. This one issued by this bank. Both types of currency were fiat currency, irredeemable, and issued by the government. Okay, so that's what they had in common. Some were more successful than others. The least stable paper currencies were in New England and in Carolina. And what I have here is the ratio between the paper note and coin. So what this means Massachusetts, I have 5-1. Let's say you have 10 pounds of silver coin, 10 pounds sterling of silver coin, 10 pounds sterling silver coin. In the marketplace, you needed 50 pounds. You need 50 pounds of notes. Or let me avoid the word pound because of the maybe confusion over, are you talking about the weight or the unit of account? Let's say you have 10 shillings worth of coin. To purchase that 10 shillings in the marketplace, you needed 50 shillings of paper notes. Why is that? Well, Massachusetts overissued. They printed a little too much money. And people figured that out. And the Massachusetts government was a little reckless with how much money they printed. And if you print too much money, as we saw in the case of China during the Ming Dynasty, it can lose its value. And in this case, it fell to a fraction of the value of coin. The worst offender was Rhode Island. Rhode Island, if you wanted to purchase 10 shillings worth of coin, you had to have 110 shillings worth of Rhode Island paper notes. Rhode Island paper notes had what we call it depreciation, had depreciated quite significantly in value. 11-1. North Carolina was also bad. It was about 10-1. South Carolina was 6-1. This was Rhode Island paper currency. Rhode Island paper currency was notorious. Just, it's not worth that much. It's not worth as much as it says that it's worth. It says it's in value equal to money, but you look at the exchange rate, not the case. A lot of inflation there. On the contrary, you had some colonies that were quite stable. Some currencies that were quite stable. Pennsylvania was one. So was New York. In Pennsylvania, the exchange, it wasn't totally on par, but it was pretty close. It was pretty close. If you had 100 shillings of worth of coins, and all you needed was 125 shillings worth of paper notes. New York was 1.5-1. So, and what determined whether or not a currency was stable or not? How reckless is the legislature in ordering new emissions? In Pennsylvania and New York, the legislature was fairly moderate and conservative in its note issue and made sure that each note was backed by a new tax, or the land bank ensured that each note was backed by a well-assessed property that would, and the land bank would enforce rules of collection and would in fact sell property that maybe a borrower had defaulted on. And as I noted, Benjamin Franklin was a major advocate of this currency, and you see his name on many of these notes. There's another one. These are all notes, again, that I handled at the Library Company of Philadelphia. By the way, the notes, they weren't huge. They were a normal size note, but it's interesting that they were a thicker paper, almost like cardboard, somewhat. Yeah, quite like cardboard. Far thicker than the paper currency that we're accustomed to today. Now, there was a lot of colonial opposition to paper money. The first point, in the case of some of these colonies like Rhode Island, where there was a lot of inflation, one of the reasons why there was a lot of inflation in Rhode Island is because you had debtor interests that had occupied seats on the legislature and intentionally inflated the currency to help them pay off their own debts. This happened in some of these colonies, just an intentional inflation to help the debtor classes. And so creditors in particular in colonies that had adopted a more reckless paper currency were severely, vehemently opposed to much of this paper money. Also, currency exchange rates fluctuated, sometimes very wildly, and a fluctuating currency can make for a very uncertain economy. And then the other point of opposition, what we have here is really a new concept of value. There's no intrinsic value in these notes, and it's obvious. It's plain on its face. All we have here is just extrinsic value 100%. And many people look at these new paper notes and are like, are you kidding me? Like, this isn't money. What, you just fired up a printing press and you call this money? This isn't money. This is money. That's money. That's value. Dating back thousands of years, silver. This? What is this? That doesn't have value. The government's trying to convince us that it has value. It's all fiction. Look at that. Shall be in value equal to money. What world are you occupying? That's not in value equal to money. That's not money at all. That's fraudulent to call that money. And besides, I've shown you some of the more cleaner looking paper currencies. It was not uncommon to encounter paper currencies that were just total, terrible shape, ragged. I'll give you a few examples here. These are some more that I came across in the archives. Look at this bill. Just, what is that? It almost seemed to expose the fraud when you would come across a note like this. This clearly doesn't, there's no value in this note. Look at that one. It's torn up and it's cheap paper. It's rags. And this challenged people's notion of value. What is value? And then you get into some more abstract questions. Look at that. Ugh. Imagine encountering this bill in trade. I don't want to touch that. I don't want to take that. A dirty bill. Have you ever encountered like an old $5 bill that's been in circulation for 25 years and it's probably been passed around a couple million times and it's just ragged and looks like it could just fall apart at any moment? Every now and then I'll come across a bill like that and I hardly even want to touch it. I get rid of it as soon as I can. This one's great. This was another bill that I saw. Apparently just got cut in half and the person said, "Oh, okay, I'll take an old letter or something and stitched it together." Again, just on its face. Well, clearly this can't have value, can it? And so again, this is very challenging for many people to accept. And then there was the problem of counterfeiting. You had counterfeiters out there who had their own plates and printing presses and that's why on many of these notes, you may have already noticed it. On many of the notes, they said, "To counterfeit is death. To counterfeit is death." And it was a capital crime in many colonies. And in other colonies, it wasn't a capital crime, but again, you were like the same with clipping. You were branded on the cheek with an iron brand, and they would brand you the letter C on your cheek for counterfeiter. Another popular punishment was cropping of the ears if you were caught counterfeiting. So counterfeiting itself sort of exposed the fraud if you were an opponent of paper currency. If the government can print money, well, why can't anybody do it? And so on and on. Of course, the proponents of it, and there were many of them, the proponents said, well, we've got to have paper currency. We don't have enough silver coin. If there was enough silver coin, we wouldn't have to do this. But there's not, and quite frankly, we don't want to use bushels of corn any longer for currency. We don't want to use, beaver skins for currency. And so we'll take this. And if the note gets ragged, we'll arrange for some sort of exchange where we'll print a nice, fresh, crisp bill and exchange it. So anyway, that's the response in the colonies. For the most part, colonists were quite supportive of this. There were loud objectors. Great Britain, as we'll see for Part C, really doesn't like this currency by around the 1720s, 1730s, and will take steps against it. And as we'll see in the next lecture, some of those steps, the aggression that Britain has against this new paper currency, sows the seeds, early seeds, for the American Revolution. We'll look at that for Part C. See you then.